Welcome, friends. Man, we don't get two nights in a row. This is incredible. I am so excited to be able to share this opportunity with you all and to invite back on the show. I'm going to call him a friend because, well, he hasn't said otherwise. So it is exciting to invite back to the stage Dr. Jerry Gladson. It is great to have you, my friend.
Thank you, my friend, for having me on.
I appreciate that. And thank you for the prayer that we had before we started this show. I always love engaging and hearing others raise their voice to the Father. So thank you. I appreciate that before we jumped on live. Well, tonight we're going to jump straight in because we don't want to do a 3.5 hour live stream like I did last night. But we have a lot to talk about. We're going to work through a few things in Daniel, specifically Daniel 8, which is the graphics and the audio that you heard and as the intro came in. But I want to kick it off first and just share a little bit. I'd love to hear a little bit about, you wrote a commentary, I believe. We're going to talk about that today, but you wrote a commentary called Endgame that deals with all of the book of Daniel. How did that get started? Why was that important to you? Tell us a little bit of background, and then we'll get into kind of the nuts and bolts of all this.
Well, that goes back a long way in my life. I have to go back to when I was first converted.
Okay.
As a young Christian in my teens, 17, 18. I was very interested in the book of Daniel at that time. And I had an old commentary by Uriah Smith that I used to read constantly. It focused on Daniel and Revelation, but my real interest was in Revelation, Daniel, rather. And that continued in my early ministry to be a focus of my study. So much later, I taught a course in Daniel at Southern Adventist University.
Mm-hmm.
And later than that, after I had retired from the pulpit, I taught a class in Daniel in the D-Min program at Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta. And so I thought one day, why don't I just take all those interests and write my own commentary on Daniel? So I used the basis of that course as my kind of structure and ended up writing the commentary that you have named, Endgame, which was published in 2021. I define this as what I call a mid-range commentary. It kind of lives between the scholarly approach to Daniel and the common approach from the pew. So it's kind of lodged in that middle ground between those two perspectives. So that's our existence.
I love that. So as the audience is coming on and as we get more people joining, I'd love to, this is going to be an interesting question, maybe an odd one. Okay. Why would anyone want to listen to what you have to say about Daniel?
That's a good question. One is, I have spent much of my life in my study of the book of Daniel. I also am fluent in the two languages that are used in Daniel, Hebrew and Aramaic. In its Greek version, Greek is used. And so I'm fluent in that as well. So I have the original languages before me and I can read the book. In fact, I translated the entire book for the commentary. The text that appears in the commentary is my translation of the Hebrew and Aramaic and the Greek that is used in the portions of Daniel that were added by the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and that are present today in what we Protestants call the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanonicals. So those are reasons. The other is my doctorate is in Hebrew Bible, and so I've studied this material at the graduate level quite a bit. So I come at it with somewhat of a background for dealing with it. And then I also have to reference my Adventist experience. Adventists, of course, have focused on the book of Daniel and Revelation for many years. So in that denomination, when I was there in that denomination, I heard many sermons on Daniel and gave many myself.
Yep.
So it was quite natural for me to want to do this project, write a commentary on Daniel. Daniel is not one of the most popular books in the Old Testament. In most of Christendom, you seldom hear it used in a sermon. Yeah. It's kind of on the periphery of interest in most churches today.
So Jerry, I would say all of those reasons are good, valid, and clearly you have more education than I do and experience and wherewithal. I would make one response, and this is, I'm trying to play the advocate on the other side, because I know that we're going to have some Adventists, watching. What would convince me that you haven't just tried to paint a picture that obscures the Adventist present truth that they understand in Daniel?
Well, I think one has to realize that the Seventh-day Adventist Church had its beginnings in the 19th century amid a kind of, let's call it an apocalyptic revival, known as the Millerite movement. A New England farmer from New York, William Miller, in the 1820s and 30s, began to focus on the book of Daniel, and particularly the visions of Daniel, including chapter 8. And he managed to figure out from chapter 8 what he thought would be the date of the end of the world, the coming of Jesus. And he began to preach this in the New England area. And the movement that he started grew to about maybe 50,000 people. It was quite notable for that era to have this kind of thing go on. That part of the country was known at that time as the Burnt Over District. And there were numerous movements that started. For example, the Mormons had their beginning at the same time in the same area. Christian Science had its beginning at the same time in the same area. Spiritualism also had its representatives. The Shakers grew up in that same era. So there was kind of a fervor and an interest in the prophecies of Daniel at the time, and Miller capitalized on that and was quite convinced that he had figured out the date in which the Lord would return and the world would come to an end. And that date he eventually settled on was 1844, and in particular, October 22. That was the date that he assigned to the end of the world. That was the date that Jesus would come. Of course, it didn't happen, and his followers were disappointed. But out of that disappointment came the early founders, the pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination. And they adopted William Miller's interpretation of Daniel, but they placed another event at the date, 1844, October 22. Instead of the second coming, they placed the beginning of the judgment of God would begin at that point in heaven. And that doctrine has remained a part of Adventist history ever since. But something else needs to be said. The Seventh-day Adventist theology or message was shaped by this apocalyptic fervor.
Yeah.
You see it in their name, Seventh-day Adventists, focused on the second coming. And the basis for that emphasis in their theology is the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, two apocalyptic writings, which are central for the core beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to this day.
Yeah.
So the Seventh-day Adventist Church grew up with this as an emphasis and has continued that to this day.
So it would be conceivable to say that because of how important both Daniel and Revelation are to many of the fundamental core beliefs and teachings in the I would say the DNA of Seventh-day Adventism.
Yes. Yes.
It is also probably some of the most triggered places where you'll get the most, I'll say it, the most twitchy responses, the most like the aggressive, the aggressive responses, especially. And one of the things we're going to cover today is going to be one of those, the 2300 days, the Daniel 8, 13, 14, that's going to be one of those things. Would you say the reason for those aggressive responses and kind of the responses that you get, is that because of how integral it is? Can you not have Seventh-day Adventist fundamental beliefs if you don't believe the way Adventists understand Daniel and Revelation?
I think that's true. I think that would be the case. That's a hypothetical, but if you did not have that particular interpretation of Daniel 8, probably you would not have Seventh-day Adventism today.
Yeah.
And I refer to another movement that arose at the same time out of the same Millerite movement as proof of that. And that's the Christian Advent Church. It does not teach that Daniel 8 is the focal point of the movement and the end of the world would come then. And that's another denomination that has arisen up from the Millerite movement that doesn't subscribe to the unique theology of Adventism on this point. For Adventism teaches something about Daniel 8 that is totally unique to them in the Christian world. No other body shares that particular perspective or that interpretation, which has made it something that is kind of a nerve in Adventism, because most Adventists realize that if that is suddenly taken away or challenged in some way, then some of the basis for the movement itself has been removed.
Yeah.
And that threatens its self-image and its self-identity.
That's sensitive. And if you threaten the self-image of the church itself, of the denomination, the members inside become threatened as well.
That's correct. That is correct.
Yeah. It definitely ties to an identity thing. And I think in some respects, and that's not, I'm not picking on Adventism. I think that we have a tendency to do that with many things in life. You know, if we identify with something, whether it's Republican, Democratic, you know, a certain
Yes.
whatever, this is a common human thing that happens because I think that we're very tribal people. And when our tribe is attacked, we feel the necessity
And
to respond.
there's nothing wrong with having a theme like this
Mm-hmm.
at the basis of your denomination, let us say, your community. This happens, almost every denomination has some theme
Mm-hmm.
that is core to their identity
Yep.
that they promote. And they all have arguments to base that on.
Yeah.
The problem with Daniel as the source of this is that Daniel is one of the most difficult books, writings in the Old Testament to interpret.
Yeah.
And there have been myriad interpretations of these things out there, particularly of the prophecies of Daniel.
Yeah.
And so grounding an interpretation, justifying an interpretation based on the text of Daniel it's a very difficult thing. There's so many parts of it we don't know a lot about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I would say it's a tentative thing. I would be very reluctant I would be very reluctant because well, as we get into this, I mean, a lot has changed since the beginning of people that have been interpreting Daniel. There's been a lot of new information. There's been a lot. So
yes,
as we go ahead.
Let me just mention something about that. In my commentary, I have a whole section that's entitled Interpreting Daniel.
Yeah.
And in that section, I go through the major ways that the book has been interpreted. And let me just mention them.
Yeah.
The 4 major ways, approaches, we might say, or strategies for interpreting Daniel. And when you understand what they are, you can see that there are contradictions among them.
Yep.
One of the most popular methods of interpreting Daniel had its roots also in the 19th century, and that was dispensationalism, or the futurist interpretation of Daniel. Now that view takes all of the prophecies of Daniel as predictive of the end stages of Earth's history, the very end stages. Some of them yet to be fulfilled, but they talk about the end stages. They talk about a rapture. They talk about people being caught up to meet the Lord in the air, and so on, leaving behind the lost on the earth. The novel series Left Behind from several years ago fictionalizes all of that in novelistic form. Well, that's the futurist interpretation of Daniel. Then you have the historicist interpretation of Daniel, which was popular from the period of the Reformation on, and it sees the prophecies of Daniel as commencing fulfillment at the time of Daniel, but then continuing unfolding fulfillment through the rest of history until you reach the end of time. So many, according to the historicist, many of the prophecies have been fulfilled. Some are yet to be fulfilled. There's kind of a gradual unfolding of these prophecies in our time. That's the historicist strategy. Okay. That is the strategy used by Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah.
It was very popular in the 19th century, and they bought into it at that point. Then we have the idealist interpretation, which takes the symbols in Daniel as idealistic. They're symbols, and they can be kind of interpreted as symbols and applied to many things. The time periods and so forth are also symbolic and can be applied to many things. Then you have what's called the preterist strategy. The preterist strategy looks for the fulfillment of Daniel in the time of Daniel and not afterward, or not more than shortly after it. That's the preterist point of view. And that is the strategy I adopted in writing this commentary. I wanted to look at what would the people who originally read Daniel in its final form, what would they have understood about all these symbols? I wanted to try to understand that and to interpret the book as they may have seen it in their own day, which is basically a preterist point of view. Now, all of these interpretations and strategies have the pluses and minuses with them. And there are strengths and weaknesses to each one. But I felt as though that you would come closer to understanding Daniel and these mysterious visions if you understood them as the writer intended them to be understood by the people who were the first readers of the book of Daniel.
Yeah. It's really, I'm glad you kind of summarized all those things and that we know kind of where you're coming from. Is it fair, before I ask my next kind of main question, is it fair to say, again, trying to be fair to all the, especially the four major ones that you mentioned, is it fair to say that all of the systems mentioned have their own problems?
Yes, they do. All of them do.
Is it also fair to say that if you're trying to interpret Daniel perfectly, it probably can't be done?
I would think that in the present state of our awareness of this, I think that would be a true statement.
So
we do not know what significant parts of Daniel are really trying to say.
Yeah.
And in my own approach to this, I would be criticized by some in my attempt to try to recapture the original meaning of Daniel as it was heard in the day it was written. They would say, you haven't done that adequately. I mentioned that earlier in the commentary, that this attempt is just simply going to be an attempt to do that, to try to understand it in that way.
Yeah.
I think something else needs to be said, too, about the material in Daniel, and that is its particular style of writing. This is, as far as we know, the first apocalyptic text in our Bible. It comes from a distinct genre or style of writing that scholars have given the name apocalyptic to it. And by that, they mean that it is a peculiar type of writing, style of writing, that focuses on the nations of the world, and symbols are used like animal-like characters, some of them very grotesque, like the ones you showed on your video just before, there to illustrate certain events going on in the world around them. Apocalypses also feature this interaction between the writer and an angel or interpreter who comes down from heaven and tries to explain these things to the writer. Some apocalypses feature heavenly journeys where the writer gets a tour of heaven and gets to see all what's going on. You've got that in Revelation. The first part of Revelation is that, where the revelator, the author, is able to tour heaven, and he sees all these people worshiping the Creator there, and so on.
Have
these symbols here, and the question is, what do they mean? Now, I find the most favorable way to understand this is to try to understand political cartoons. If you are a part of our culture, let's say today, and you see a political cartoon, and it has, let's say, an elephant in it, it has a donkey in it, and it has other characters like a pig-looking creature there. Being a part of this culture, you know what that means.
Yeah.
You know that this cartoon is saying something about Republicans, the elephant, and the Democrats, and maybe the president. One time in a class that I taught in Daniel, I brought in some political cartoons. I reference this in the commentary. And I took a modern one, which was relevant to the time, and I had the class interpret the symbols. And they immediately identified it as, okay, it had, I think, 5 figures riding a donkey. Well, it so happens at the time that there were 5 people trying to get elected as the Democratic candidate for president. The class could identify each one of them. Then I brought out a cartoon from the 1840s election. I think it was 1840. And I held that up, and nobody could identify it. They were not familiar enough with the time in which it was composed and the circumstances and the situation to identify it. Well, apocalyptic is something like that. It's a coded language. And the people who are familiar with the circumstances of the times can recognize who these animal-like creatures are in the text. Even when they're not identified as they are in chapter 8, you hear there about Persia, you hear about Greece, and so on. But even the ones that are unidentified, they know what they are, because they are conversant with what's going on.
Yeah.
Now, as time passes with this material, and it recedes more into the past, we lose that key because we aren't participating in the social situation of the times.
That makes sense.
Lose the key. And so we lose the key to interpreting Daniel. And that leads then to a number of different interpretations of this. I know with Daniel that these animal-like creatures have been identified with all kinds of figures throughout history.
Yeah.
Whoever was the villain of the times is usually identified with a little horn and so forth in Daniel, and so on, because we've lost the key. And the only way we can get that key back is to reconstruct it by doing some careful historical investigation into the text and its background, which is what I tried to do with the commentary.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. I love that explanation. I think that really helps us kind of get behind where you're coming from, especially when you're approaching this particular text. Before I go into, I want to get into the dating and the authorship in just a second.
Okay.
I know that there's a phrase that you use in your commentary that's called the hermeneutic of retrieval.
Yes.
Can you explain how the hermeneutic of retrieval differs from like the traditional biblical interpretation methods that might be out there, or maybe people are familiar with?
Okay, that maybe a way into that question would be to contrast the futurist interpretation of Daniel with the preterist interpretation. In futurism, you see the book of Daniel as predictive of the end of time. The very end of time is in view in the book of Daniel. Whereas the preterist interpretation attempts to get at this text by retrieving the actual historical setting of the book and its writing, as much as that can be done. That would be called a hermeneutic of retrieval, a strategy for retrieving it. We want to know what was going on in that period of time. And there are various sources for that, by the way, that we use. We look at some of the ancient historians, such as the Greek historian Herodotus. We look at the writings of Philo, Judaeus, contemporary of Paul in the first century, in Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher. And we look at Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived in the first century CE, and who said a great deal about these prophecies in Daniel and how they were understood at the time. So we reach back to sources like that, including the Bible, but also archaeological materials. We examine, too, that textual materials that we find that help us to interpret Daniel, such as the so-called Cyrus cylinder. A cuneiform record of the exploits of Cyrus the Great, who is mentioned in the book of Daniel. So we go back to sources like that in an effort to reconstruct or to retrieve, use that term, to retrieve the actual social setting in the theological setting of the book of Daniel, as much as we can do that. It's always imperfect. We can't quite do it entirely. That is, we can't go back there and be there alongside the first readers of Daniel and gain their understanding completely.
So that leads us into a really good kind of next point of conversation. So in the New Testament, there's a really important date that plays a role in how someone might interpret things. This event that happened AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. Depending on Revelation, if it was written prior to or after, or some of the Gospels, the way they were written, and some of the other things. So there's a date. It becomes valuable for certain books to be able to determine what the date is of this kind of authorship, when it was written. And I say when it was written because I already know a little bit about your perspective, and I'll ask it anyways, though. There's two main approaches to the dating of Daniel: second century, 6th century, early, late, however people phrase it. Why does it matter?
Well, dating the book, the dating of the writing of Daniel, is key to retrieving the original context of it.
Okay.
That's why it's important. If you're off on the date of the book's writing, you could well be off on the interpretation of some of its symbols and some of the periods of time that are given in it.
Okay.
So that's why it's important to try to clarify how the book originated and how it came into existence and under what circumstances it came into existence. So that's what's important. But there is wide disagreement on that, as you've just alluded to.
Yeah. So I think many Christians, I'm going to be very broad in this kind of observation. I think many Christians, at least my experience has been that most Christians are very unfamiliar with the process of compiling, what we call a book. There weren't even codices. I mean, they didn't really have books per se at this time period, at least not the way we think of.
They had scrolls.
Right. And, even today, I don't know if anyone in the chat has written a book. I know that Jerry has written several. Books get written, even if it's by one author, over a period of time. Generally speaking, they don't just sit down and over a week, they just write the book out and stamp it out. And there it is. Here we go. So help us understand, like, what was the process, and why do you feel like this process that you're going to share about how it was compiled and written, why do you feel like it's the most accurate way to perceive the way it was written?
Well, if we think of the biblical books as, let's say, to use your illustration, having been written in one sitting.
Yeah.
So the author sits down and, under the inspiration of God, writes the whole book, just straight out. If we perceive it that way, that's not the way it happened.
Yeah.
That's an erroneous view. Even a modern book, such as, I'll just take my commentary as an example. My commentary draws on many sources, and it was written over a period of time.
Yeah.
And it was in my mind long before that. Yeah. One earlier version of it are the lecture notes I gave in that class I taught. That was several years ago. So there was a process involved in the writing of this commentary until it got down to the end. Yeah. And thus, in the biblical times, there also was a process with most books. Let's just keep that to the Old Testament, because probably some of the New Testament epistles may have been written in one sitting, but the Gospels were not.
Yeah.
And also, you have to take into consideration that the concept of authorship differed from what it is today. Today, we have strict copyright laws. And in a published book, you can't just cite materials out of a published book without obeying copyright laws, or you'd be sued for plagiarism. But in biblical times, that was not the case.
Yeah.
And they had a more, I like to call it, a more communal understanding of writing, that a book was the product of the whole community, not just one person. There may have been several authors involved in the writing of the major books. For example, in Jeremiah, to take an example of that, in Jeremiah, you have materials that came from Jeremiah, and you have materials that came from Baruch, his assistant.
Yep.
Right there in the same book. And then, interestingly, at the end of Jeremiah, at the end of chapter 51, and there are 52 chapters in Jeremiah, at the end of chapter 51 is a note that says, "This is the end of the words of Jeremiah." And then comes chapter 52. Another author has placed that with the book of Jeremiah.
Yeah.
And they felt much more at liberty to alter the text in ways that they would make it clarified in some way. So there was this process during which a book came together. It is not unlike a book today comes together, drawn from many sources and so forth. An author brings them together and puts them together and edits them in one thing. So many of these books experienced a similar kind of editing that goes on in writing of a book. The book of Daniel, no doubt, came together through one of those kinds of processes.
So would this be a good place to discuss the concept of pseudonymity?
Yes, we could do that. Pseudonymity is the attribution of a writing usually to a famous figure, a figure of honor and renown in the culture of the time. And it was used widely in the ancient world. We have many Roman and Greek examples of it. We have examples of it in our own world. Mark Twain, for example, is not really Mark Twain. It's Daniel Clemens.
Yep.
That's an example of it. I was thinking of George Eliot.
Yep.
British writer is not really George Eliot, that's someone else. And we have writers today who write under pseudonyms.
Yep.
This was much more common practice in biblical times. Let's just take the book of Daniel, because I do make the statement in my commentary that Daniel actually is very close to being a pseudonym, pseudonymous writing. For example, the first 6 chapters of Daniel, which contains the stories of Daniel, are written in, Daniel is written in third person. Which suggests someone else is writing about Daniel. The last 6 chapters, which are largely apocalyptic visions, these are the writings that appear in first person. That sharp distinction is made between the sections. So it seems reasonable to think that what you have here are visions written by a man by the name of Daniel that have been coupled together with stories about Daniel, written down by someone else who is unnamed. So you have a situation here where the anonymous writer of Daniel has done the first 6 chapters, and the last 6 chapters are in almost first person for the most part.
I can imagine for some that might be hearing this that hasn't spent a lot of time in apocalyptic literature, in Second Temple literature, in Old Testament literature, that doesn't really understand how books were even compiled, written. I'll make a statement that some might not be familiar with. I would assume you probably will. I don't think Moses wrote all of Genesis. I think the first probably 10 chapters, maybe less, could have been someone else, just because there's a lot of Mesopotamian culture that especially is in the creation account that doesn't seem to fit, the culture that Moses would have. Now, whether or not that's true or not, it's we're talking, maybe not. I bring that up only because I think it's important that a book like Daniel doesn't have to be written by one person in order for it to be considered inspired, authoritative, like all the things that we believe about Scripture. And I think that's where people get really turned off or triggered, is like, oh no, somehow Jerry is diminishing the value of Scripture because you're changing what's always been in my mind.
Okay, I accept the inspiration of the Bible, and here's how I understand it. I think that however the process was with any particular book in the Bible, however the process by which that came into being, from the mind of the author to the writing of the text, to the editing of the book, that whole process is where we locate inspiration. The inspiration or the guidance of the Holy Spirit is at work all along the way with Scripture. From the beginning to the end of it, the Holy Spirit is at work. Now, it's a characteristic, though, of biblical books that few of them ever tell you their author.
Yeah.
I mean, Genesis is a good example of that. Genesis doesn't tell you who wrote it.
Nope.
Not anywhere. It's not there. Let's take the book of Deuteronomy, which is usually attributed to Moses by some. The 34th chapter of Deuteronomy tells of Moses' death and burial. Well, obviously he didn't write that.
Yeah.
It was written by someone else and put into the book as to complete the record of Moses' ministry.
Yeah.
It was completed at that point.
Yeah.
But the biblical books typically do not tell you who the author is.
Yeah.
They almost all are anonymous. And you have to guess, or you have to try to discern who might have written them from the contents of the book. And that's often very difficult.
I think it's important. That's the reason why you brought up the hermeneutical retrieval. Like it's important, the historical context of the author and identifying the process of doing that it's not located necessarily just in the text. It's located in the community texts around. There's other scrolls, there's other writings, there's other people talking about it. So that helps us. And this is a part of textual criticism. Like that's a whole division of scholarship that helps to kind of station these manuscripts in their right place and kind of chronologically how they came about and all that stuff. All of that to say, it helps us, I would say, be more grounded in the inspiration and what it is that we have in Scripture than if we didn't have all this. If we were just truly guessing, we wouldn't be grounded too well.
Yes, it's when the New Testament says all Scripture is inspired by God, it's referring to this total process. The complete, how shall we put it, the complete supervision of and guidance of the writers of the text, even though many of them are unknown, who are composing this material, we believe are guided by the Holy Spirit in that process. That's where the inspiration is located in the production of these books and understanding them. And from the reference in 2 Peter 1, we get the impression that the inspiration also extends to a certain degree to the ones who are reading it, illuminating their understanding of the text in different ways. I think that broadens one's understanding of inspiration to see it that way.
Yeah.
I think to see it as though the Holy Spirit is dictating a book and says to the writer, write this. I saw a vision.
The mechanical perspective of inspiration is very limited and it's very archaic. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think originally the Adventist position was much more dictation mechanical. And it was until I think 1919 at the Bible conference that the verbal inspiration, they kind of adjusted the way they kind of perceived it in the process of their historical development.
I asked a Bible class the other day where they would locate. We were studying the inspiration. I asked them where they would locate it. I said, is it in the text? Is it in the author? Is it in the reader? And the question was confusing to them. The mechanical view of inspiration locates it in the text. So it's the text itself, the words of the text.
Yeah.
And I said to someone, if you locate it in the words, you cannot translate it because it's locked into a certain word with a certain meaning. And to translate it is to change that or to modify that in some way. So you move on to it's in the author. Okay, so the author is inspired by God and writes these things down. That's good. I think that's an acceptable way of viewing inspiration. And the Adventist view is that, by the way, it's located in the author.
Yep.
It's located in the thoughts of the author. And that's a welcome view. My view is a little broader than that now. I locate it in the total process.
Yeah.
In the complete process of the production of the scriptural text.
And I think part of the reason why, and I know some of you might be, why are you guys kind of talking about this aspect? Well, we're going to finish a few things with regards to, the authorship and some dating and stuff, and then we're going to move into the meat of Daniel 8. But what anyone who critically examines Daniel, original language, they're doing real good. Again, you're not like just blinded by tradition. You're actually getting into the meat of the text. You mentioned in your commentary that there are significant chronological discrepancies. There are what we would call potential issues. Okay. from a historical reference standpoint. How do these potential issues, or at least perceived issues, we'll say it that way, how does it translate into your understanding of the dating of the book? Because I know that you see it, probably the dating of the book, as not the traditional approach to it. You can kind of share with the audience what your view is on that. But how does understanding the authorship in the way that you see it help an individual deal with the seemingly historical discrepancies or chronological discrepancies in the book?
Oh, okay. That's a fair question. You mentioned historical criticism earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Let me start with that. From one perspective, historical criticism is simply the attempt historically to retrieve the actual background of a book and its historical setting. That's what historical criticism is all about. Going back as near as we can to the original setting of a book and how it came into being. With Daniel, I place the writing of Daniel, what I call the final version of Daniel, for it may have had a process before this. I place it in the 2nd century BC or BCE. That's where most scholars place it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the result of careful historical work with trying to discover the background of the text and its actual development. And that's based on several factors. It's based, for example, on the close resemblance between the little horn power that appears in chapter 7 and chapter 8 with the rising up of a king, a Syrian king, by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes
Mm-hmm.
in the 2nd century. And this is confirmed by the book of 1st Maccabees, which was written at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes.
Mm.
And they draw the language of Daniel into 1st Maccabees as a description of this event. So that's one indication that the writer was well aware of the historical background of that for that reason. That there are historical discrepancies or perceived historical discrepancies. One of them has to do with the date that appears in the 1st chapter. Appears to be a date too early for this event.
Mm-hmm.
By about a year. It's not significant there. There also appears to be some discrepancies in what happened to King Belshazzar in chapter 5, where the writing appears on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And Belshazzar is said to be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom, or the ruler in the kingdom, when actually the ruler of Babylon at that time was Nabonidus, his father. There's also some confusion in Daniel 4 with the king there. Nebuchadnezzar is his name there, and his experience of being afflicted with a case of what's zoanthropy, the idea that he was a beast and eats grass like an oxen in the field, loses his mind, in other words. We have a text from the Dead Sea, which ascribes a similar experience to Nabonidus, not Belshazzar, not Nebuchadnezzar. So some think that chapter 4 in Daniel is really taking that other experience of Nabonidus and fixing it on Nebuchadnezzar. That's debatable. But those are some of the areas where we're not quite sure of the history back of these and what it is saying in that respect.
So the last thing I want to touch on, and I felt like this was really, when I read through the commentary, we're not going to spend our whole time on this. We could spend an entire episode on just authorship. I mean, probably multiple episodes. There's so much that can be discussed. I want to get to chapter 8. Inevitably, what comes up with the dating question is, I think Christians, I don't know if it's because the internet spits it out first. I don't know if it's because most aren't well read when it comes to like the challenges of authorship and dating of the book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
But the most common response is, oh, you're just falling prey to the famous first guy that made the claim that it was 2nd century, who really didn't believe in scripture and was trying to, demean it. You know where I'm going. Porphyry.
Mm-hmm.
And why is it that, because you made the comment that most scholars today, and again, that doesn't mean all, okay,
Mm-hmm.
but the majority of scholars date it as the 2nd century, and they don't buy into the reasons that Porphyry, if I'm saying that right,
Correct.
made. So why is it that they will still continue to agree with that, but not line with his reasoning?
Well, yes, Porphyry tended to see the idea that there could be predictive prophecy as false, that these were made up and erroneous. But that isn't necessary to say that. There is such a thing as genuine predictive prophecy, and some of it you have in Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
It looks ahead beyond the scene that you have. But there is good evidence that Daniel comes in the period of time of the 2nd century. For example, if you want to see Daniel, well, let's just introduce Matthew 24 into this discussion.
Okay. Yeah.
The verse in Matthew 24 that's sometimes quoted about this.
Yeah. Let me get it on the screen. Matthew 24.
Matthew 24, 15.
15. All right, let's go to it. And this is the NRSV updated edition is what this is.
Okay.
So.
All right. Now, first the context here. This is Matthew 24. It is one of 3 versions of what is known as Jesus' little apocalypse. Notice the word apocalypse. This is an apocalyptic text. Jesus is giving this in apocalyptic style. And he's talking mainly about, in this chapter, about the destruction of Jerusalem, which was imminent in his day, would come some 30 or 40 years later in 70 AD. And here he's warning about that, verse 15. So when you see the desolating sacrilege, you could put quotation marks around that, because that's a citation from Daniel, from the Greek version of Daniel, actually, spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. Let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now, as this text stands, it is a reference to the Roman power. Rome would be coming in to sack the city of Jerusalem and besiege it and eventually destroy it. It's a little clearer in Luke. Luke actually names the troops coming in standing in the holy place. Some people see this as a reference to the writing of the book of Daniel in the 6th century BCE instead of the 2nd century. Because Jesus cites, well, chapter 9 and chapter 11 has this expression in it. And in the context of Daniel, now, this desolating sacrilege was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who had desecrated the temple by placing an idol to the Greek god Jupiter, or Zeus rather, in the temple adjacent to the altar of burnt offerings, which was considered an act of desecration. And the Hebrew there is just, these are almost swear words they're used of this, that sacrilege given to the temple. And that's the reference to that term, desolating sacrifice, spoken of by the Daniel prophet. And Jesus here applies this to the Roman attempt to come into Jerusalem. And the way I understand this text, Jesus is using this as an example. That is, when you see something like the desolating sacrilege, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, he's making a comparison. Now, there is a text in 2nd Esdras, 4th Esdras sometimes, has two names. I think it's in chapter 14. I reference it in my commentary. That where the prophet Ezra is being informed about these prophecies of Daniel, and the angel says to him, and the book of 2nd Esdras was written in the 1st century, almost contemporary with the desolation of Jerusalem, 70 AD. And the angel says to the prophet Ezra, the writer, this interpretation, which I am telling you about, which applies this to Rome, this interpretation is not the one I gave Daniel. It's different. So the angel is saying that he is reinterpreting Daniel 8 of this desolating sacrifice and applying it to Rome now and not to Antiochus Epiphanes. This is an example of how apocalyptic literature is capable of multiple interpretations and is open to that kind of thing, perhaps deliberately so. It's coded language, after all, and it is meant, in part at least, to obscure things.
Yeah.
So this is an example of a reinterpretation. If you want to see Jesus doing that here, that would be an acceptable way of understanding that passage. Or you could see it as an example, so that something like this, when you see something like the desolating sacrilege spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, like Antiochus Epiphanes once did, let the reader understand this.
I think, to your point, I think that oftentimes people miss this little parenthetical.
Yes.
This is in the text. This isn't the translator's like adding this. This is in the text. It's cueing the audience. This is not, again, just to be very clear, Jesus didn't necessarily say, let the reader understand. No. Jesus is making a statement, and whoever is Matthew, who's authoring this, is, as he's writing this down, saying, hey, you guys understand, you guys know what he's talking about, right? Yeah. You remember that thing back in the Old Testament with Antiochus? Like, you're supposed to know, kind of. I think the challenge is that most people, it's almost like they have a mind block that the abomination can only be one thing. And when you tie to Daniel 9, where it says the temple is destroyed, that's what ties them to a concept that it must be obliterated in order for it to be fulfilled. And that's just not That's just not the case.
That's correct. And this statement here, let the reader understand, is probably a comment of the author of the gospel.
Yep.
Or an editor thereof who's put that in to let the reader know you need to be very careful about understanding what this is that's being talked about in this text. I just refer to an Adventist author and an Adventist scholar, Leroy Froome.
Yep.
Wrote a 4-volume set, 4 thick volumes, in which he traced the various interpretations of these symbols in Daniel down through the ages and how they were applied differently all the way along until you get to the Adventist understanding of Daniel 8, which is another of the interpretations that is out there of this event in Daniel 8.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, we're an hour and 11 minutes in. And we've already gotten so much done, but we haven't even gotten into Daniel 8 specifically. And I know I know that people are going to want to jump straight to the most important, Daniel 8, 13, 14. I don't know if you want to go there, if you want to set up kind of that part of the chapter. I know that 7 goes with 8. And then, I mean, there's so much that needs to be worked through, but where would you like to pick up with regards to
why don't you put up on the screen that section 8:13 through.
Is there a preferred version that you would like me to have on the screen?
The one you have on the screen is fine.
Okay.
I'll make some comments about it.
Sure.
Yeah. Now, this vision is similar to the one in chapter 7, in which the ancient empires, are depicted as animals. And in this particular one, as you showed in your video that you began this with, you have a ram and a goat.
Yep.
And the ram stands for the Persian Empire, which preceded, and that's actually put in the text. You see it in the text itself. Then the ram, the goat with this notable horn between its eyes represents the Greek Empire, which, if you remember from ancient history, defeated the Persians and took over the world in that time. And so that's represented here by the ram and the goat coming together, and the ram is thrown to the ground and no one could rescue it.
And Jerry, we get those, that explanation, because I don't see it here in the text, but for the audience, we get that by further going down and reading.
Right. It's in verse 15 and onward. That's right.
Yep. Right. In this
there. And then the Greek lamb or ram, or well, it's a ram actually too. A sheep. The horn that comes out would be a reference to Alexander the Great. Now, the people living in that day and age who got this and read it for the first time would immediately recognize that Alexander had conquered the known world. In very recent history. Then they would have known it. And then the horn is broken, and then there come up other horns out of it, and one of those comes up, and it is the one that tramples on the sanctuary, which would be the temple here, the Jewish temple here. And that's what's concerning in 13 and 14. The writer wants to know how long will this power trample down the sanctuary and desecrate it. And so the time is given here in verses 13 and 14. How long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering and the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary, which would be the temple, to it? And the answer is given for 2,300, and you need to notice this translation. This follows the Hebrew directly. 2,300 evenings and mornings then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Most see in this vision a depiction of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was one of the kings that rose up in place of Alexander the Great. Alexander's empire, when Alexander died at age 33 in Egypt, the empire broke up and eventually coalesced around 4 different kings. The Syrians, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and so forth. Antiochus Epiphanes was one of the Seleucid or Syrian kings that came to power. And he had it in for the Jewish people. He persecuted them. He besieged the city of Jerusalem, slaughtered a bunch of them. But eventually, he banned, talk about book banning, he banned the Torah, the sacred text of the Jews. It was that you come under the death penalty if you were caught possessing a Torah, the scroll of the Torah. He forbade the observance of the Sabbath. And worst of all, he took away the regular offerings that were offered in the temple. And these were 2 main offerings that were mentioned here: the evening and morning sacrifices. They are mentioned in Numbers 29, if you want to read about them. You don't have to go there. I guess with keeping with time, we should just summarize that. And that's what's discussed in verse 13. How long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering that was offered in the morning and in the evening? Kind of like morning prayer and evening prayer. And he took away those offerings, and he set up this altar to Zeus or Jupiter in the holy place, which was the first room of the temple, and in the courtyard where there was a burnt offering altar. He set this offering up either beside it, or some texts seem to imply he put it over it, where they offered pigs, which was a very desecrating thing to do in a Jewish temple on that altar, and thus they defiled it. This led to a rebellion, a revolt in the kingdom, in which the Maccabee brothers revolted against Antiochus and eventually managed to take Jerusalem again and cleanse the temple and restore it. That's what's being discussed in this text. It says, how long will the vision concerning this be? For 2,300 evenings and mornings, the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. And that happened in 164 BCE. We know the date that it was cleansed and restored to its rightful state. Now, the problem with this verse in terms of the Adventist understanding of it, their doctrine of the investigative judgment is based almost wholly on this verse, Daniel 8:14.
Yep.
This is, if I may say so, a strategic hermeneutical mistake. It's a no-no to base a whole doctrine on a single verse in Scripture.
Yep.
That's what's being done here. If this verse is taken like this and given in the interpretation that Adventists give it, you have based a whole doctrine on this one verse. Let's just look at it a little closer. 2,300, the Greek text, the Septuagint.
You want me to?
Ancient Greek translation of these texts. The Greek text and the King James Version read for 2,300 days. But that's not what's in this text.
Mm-mm.
That is a translation of what's in this text. The text has Erev Boker,
Yep.
evening, morning. And it is a reference to the morning and evening sacrifices that were offered every day in the temple, so that 2,300 of them would be 1,150 such sacrifices. And if you apply that to the chronology of Antiochus Epiphanes, that comes out about right. From 167, when he desecrated this by taking those away, to the time that it was cleansed in 164 is about 1,150 days.
So I think one of I've had a lot of, as you probably have, a lot of pushback on all of the places that the temporal. I've heard arguments about how long is this vision? Well, that's not really related to how long. It's the end point. It's not that's they get all this like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've heard all kinds of things about like who the one horn is coming out. Is it coming out of this part, or is it coming out of that part? And as you kind of said, well, it's a strategic interpretation to make sure that it comes down to what they need, because they need this text inevitably for the investigative judgment. Now, why do we not have to have, because one of the common arguments is, well, if you take 2,300, you cut it in half like you did. Well, Jerry, that doesn't land exactly. Like it's not exactly precise. And so because it's not exactly precise, it's wrong, throw the whole thing out.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that a poor way of understanding?
Well, if you understand this verse, 8, 13, 14, against the time in which it was written, believed to have been written, then you can see its application to a person living in the second century, middle of the second century, reading a text like this, would have immediately known what it's talking about.
Yeah.
Would have immediately known this is a reference to the famous, or rather infamous, desecration of the temple. By the way, the word sanctuary here in this text is the word kodesh or kadosh. There you see it on the screen, kodesh, which is a reference to the temple. The temple was the sacred place, holy place. That's what the word means.
It's not the most holy place?
No, it isn't. The altar was set up in the courtyard, actually.
Yep.
And not the most holy place.
I say that because Adventists like to get to the most holy place with 1844, which is interesting because I don't think anything was. Last I checked, the holy place in heaven wasn't desecrated or trampled.
No, it wasn't. No, the word kadosh here is a reference to the whole temple complex.
Yep.
And it was in what was called the courtyard that you have this altar of burnt offerings, and that's where the evening and morning sacrifice would have been offered, and that's where he sets up his other alternative altar for Zeus, deliberately so.
Yep.
He's doing this deliberate to desecrate this sacred site.
And it says something about his, in the previous section of the text, it talks about him magnifying himself.
That's right. Yeah,
this act of arrogance.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. He was viewed as a very arrogant individual, and he added in for the Jewish people all the way along. We're not sure why exactly, but he did have it in for them. He taxed them excessively, everything he could to interrupt their life. But someone living in that century would have immediately understood what this is talking about.
Yeah.
Now, the problem comes in here with, say, the futurist interpretation of this, Or let's take the Adventist historicist interpretation of this. Adventists take the reference here, 2,300 days, and we remember that William Miller, who originated this particular time interpretation, did not have the Hebrew at his disposal, did not have the Greek text. He had only the King James Version, which had days in there, which is already an interpretation of the text.
Yep.
It's a good illustration of how translations are, in the end, interpretation.
Yeah, on that statement, I just heard, actually, it's funny you bring that up. I just heard either today or yesterday that another scholar, I'll leave the name out because some people will probably twitch if I say the name, that the King James Bible actually isn't a version. It's a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation.
This is true. It itself has a history.
Yeah.
A translational history. It lies behind it.
And
it is kind of a culmination of a whole series of translations.
Yep. And of course, most Adventists, I think, are familiar with the fact that the early pioneers predominantly, not always, but predominantly utilized the King James translation or version. But I also want to point out that none of the original pioneers understood Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic. None of them could read the original language. So they're heavily dependent on a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. And they're doing what common Adventists today do, which is word association fallacy, which they're taking days here and days here, connecting them together and claiming that's what it is, which is just a horrible approach to.
They apply what's called the year-day principle.
Yep.
Which they believe is operative in these apocalyptic texts, where a day in the text equals a year. Now, they're a bit fuzzy on how long that year is. Is it 360 days, 365? But we won't go into that.
Yeah.
So the 2,300 evenings and mornings becomes 2,300 days or years.
Yeah.
And so then they look for the beginning of that, and they take that to be 457.
Can you speak just for a brief moment on the challenges of? Can we be certain that if we were to assume the Adventist position to be accurate up to that point, what level of confidence would we even have to know that 457 is the actual start date?
Well, the problem with it, 457, it's one of three possible dates.
Yeah.
That you could date the start. It's actually dating the start of the return from exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem and restoring the temple. But there are three dates that the book of Ezra gives for this. One is 538, which was when Cyrus the Great became king of Persia and its empire. And he gave the command to let them go back up to Jerusalem to start the rebuilding process. That's on the Cyrus cylinder. We have actually a record about it. And some excerpts of it may be actually quoted in Ezra. Then there is a second date, namely 520, some 18 years later, when King Darius also gave a decree to go back up and rebuild the city, the dates. And then we come down to 457, or rather 458, which is the date most scholars prefer for this, when a king by the name of Artaxerxes II authorized a return from captivity to Jerusalem in 457. And that's cited in an Aramaic text in the book of Ezra. Maybe a citation of that. So you have three possibilities for this date, and it's not certain which one is the correct interpretation. So you got a problem at that level.
So it's best for us to just pick the one we like, right? And then just assign a doctrine to it.
Precisely that. What happened was precisely that. One was picked that fitted into the interpretation of the time span.
And it was acquired from William Miller. I mean, this isn't a,
yes.
This isn't an Adventist new thing. This is something that moved over from William Miller. In fact, I even think Ellen White makes a pretty atrocious statement that God put his hand over the fact that it was the wrong whatever, so that they could be, I don't know if she uses the word deceived, but that was all part of his plan to confuse them or something. I forget the exact phrasing, but
yes, that's correct. She does say that about this. So you start with 457, and if you regard the 2300 as years, you can date that all the way down to 1844.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the date that William Miller settled on eventually as to the time that the world would come about.
At first it was 1843, right? Because they forgot I think they forgot the year that flipped over or something. They forgot something.
Also, they realized they had the wrong date because the second coming didn't happen. So they got fired up with another date, 1844.
Yeah.
And that became the date. Now the Adventists have taken William Miller's time interpretation here, dating from 457 BC down to 1843 or 44, and have applied to it the idea of another event, namely the beginning of the great judgment of God, which is believed to have started on October 22, 1844, and has been going on since that time.
Yeah, which is leading into the investigative judgment doctrine and the concepts of
the doctrine of the investigative judgment, which is a unique teaching of Seventh-day Adventism. No other denomination has that.
Yeah,
it's unique.
Yeah. And I'm going to reiterate what you said earlier for those that are newer that are watching, or maybe they have forgotten with regards to this. Daniel 8, 13 and 14, and the Adventist understanding specifically of this phrase, the 2300 evenings and mornings, is absolutely required, 100% required, in order to get to the investigative judgment dating the 1844. Without this verse, it cannot be exegeted. You cannot get there.
No, you can't get there. I saw this quite early in my Adventist career. I realized that you could not get from this text to the doctrine of the investigative judgment without some serious monkeying with the text. I saw that quite early. And therefore, when Desmond Ford comes along in the late 70s, we talked about this before, he says the same thing.
Yeah.
In a speech that I call it the speech that was heard around the world. He challenged that whole idea. And I realized when he did, that's exactly what I've seen in this text. One of the reasons why I have been engaged with Daniel, and one of the reasons that I studied Hebrew and Greek, was to be able to get at the original language of these texts. This chapter is in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
Chapters 2 through 7 is in Aramaic, but this one's in Hebrew, and so you have Hebrew in this case here. Notice that it's not, then the sanctuary will be cleansed, but it shall be restored to its rightful state. The word nitzdak, which you have there on the screen, means to set right from the desecration.
Yeah.
It would be set right.
Now, the common, I think we could probably do this reasonably quick. Maybe not. But the common response from an Adventist position, if we just roll with it, and this has become more and more popular with scholars like Roy Gaines. I think Johnson is another guy. I forget if it's Johnston or Johnson, that like to tie this nizdak to the concept of being cleansed in Leviticus. Can we, maybe however long you want to go into this, can we talk about that possibility as well as maybe that challenge and what causes the potential issue with regards to that from a language standpoint?
Okay, well, one have to understand that what Adventists do with this is they tie it into the ancient Day of Atonement ritual, which was an annual event in the Jewish calendar that comes in our September, October. We Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which was viewed as a kind of judgment in Judaism. It was the time in the year in which you look back on the year and you recognized your failings and you brought those to judgment and you sought the forgiveness of God there. And that was done in a ritual in which there were two goats. And the priest would cast lots on those two goats. One of the goats would be designated as the Lord's goat, and it would be sacrificed as a blood sacrifice. The other one would be designated as Azazel, the goat of Azazel, which is probably a reference to a demonic notion. And that goat would be turned loose into the wilderness, and all the sins of Israel would be symbolically laid on that goat. And it would go out and take them away from the camp, like a scapegoat from the camp or the nation of Israel. And that was embodied in a ritual. And Adventists see this as a typological thing, that the great day of judgment will follow that typology, in which the sins of all will be called up, and it will be determined what sins have been forgiven and what sins have not been. And those sins will be laid upon Satan, who act as a kind of scapegoat. So that whole typological scenario is the way that they involve the language. So the word tzedek, which means just or righteous or right, RGHT, right before God, is linked up with the word taher, which means cleansing, one of the words used for cleansing. And it is pointed out in some of the writings that taher and tzedek are in the same semantic field. That is, they share meanings. And therefore, there is this relationship between cleansed, that was in the King James version of this, and in the Septuagint, katharizo, there's a connection between that word and tzedek in this text. Therefore, it evokes the whole Day of Atonement scenario in its typology. And that's confusing to most people. At least I've always found it so, to get into this sort of thing. Sounds very confusing.
It's confusing to read, it's been difficult for me to even process the way that the Adventist scholars try to move through the way the hoops they jump through and the leaps they make to get to the possible, like I'm okay with saying like, okay, that's a potential. I'm not saying it's not plausible, but it definitely isn't. It isn't seen this way by too many people.
That's right. In fact, you can see it somewhat in the light of the fact that Daniel has generated manifold interpretations of all this.
Yeah.
And this is one of those.
Yeah.
It's as you say, it's in one sense, it's kind of a plausible way of understanding this, but is it accurate? That was my question. Is this really true to the text? Because I wanted to know what was true to this text.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was there in this text from the beginning when he was first issued, let's say, first came into print in his final form? Was that the meaning that was present in this text? And I had to answer that with a no.
Yeah.
This was not there. This represents one of those reinterpretations that was made of this. And it was made by a kind of, shall we say, maybe this is too strong a word, manipulating the text in such a way that it fitted this time scheme.
Yeah.
457, 1844.
Well, it's part of the reason why the Daniel committee that meant the symposium that meant to try to solve this problem. I don't remember how many years, if it was 3, 4, 5, however many years they meant to try to solve, ultimately with conclusion, and ultimately the Adventist, the conference or who officially disbanded it because
they couldn't solve it.
They could not solve this predicament, this problem that ultimately needed to be solved.
And you see where Ford got into trouble wasn't calling attention to that.
Yeah.
In pointing out that through all these years we never solved this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll quote someone here. I think it'd be appropriate to quote this individual because this is actually in print. Siegfried Horn.
Yeah.
Now, there's no scholar in Adventism that is more admired than Siegfried Horn. He was an archaeologist, specialist in ancient civilizations. He stands behind the Adventist commentary and a bunch of other books. Siegfried Horn once said, as they were wrestling with all this, he said, "You cannot get from the text of Daniel to the doctrine of the investigative judgment. It cannot be done."
Yep.
And I just hold up as proof of that all of the Adventist attempts to do it, which have fallen short.
I think that quote is in Ostriches and Canary, the Canary and Ostriches book.
That is correct.
Yeah. It cannot be done, and it's funny to me how so many lay Adventist members in the chat like to just, it's so simple, it's so this and it's so that, and I just want to say, friends, like, slow down, like slow your roll, like it's complicated. I don't like, before you speak ignorance like that. You need to be aware. Now, I do want to ask a couple of there's some questions from the chat because I know that we're coming up on our time. We're actually 15 minutes over what you had originally wanted, and I appreciate your graciousness. A couple of questions, and one that always comes up because as you know, in this passage with regards to the 2300, we already mentioned it. Adventists like to claim it to be this is literal days. They go to places like creation. They kind of the morning and evenings thing, and they make their case that this can be seen as days. Which, for the sake of argument, I'm going to say, okay, let's give that to them for a second. Let's just say that's the case. Okay. Hurdle number one. Hurdle number two, in the context of Daniel, would be what would give me the right to claim that those days are now prophetic years. Now, the question is because this individual at the bottom, I'm going to go to this other screen here. makes this assertion. There's no reason behind it. This is the common proof text parroting Adventist position. That's like, oh yeah, silly us, right? We forgot that Numbers 14 and Ezekiel 4 are the proof text references for day for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I not allowed, or what? Let me say it a different way. What reason would I be given from a contextual standpoint to claim that if these are days, that now all of a sudden I can make them years? Is there any reason?
Because it's not in the text of Daniel. I mean, what's your basis for taking Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6 and relating them to Daniel 8:13-14? What is your basis for that? That's just a claim that you are making. There's nothing in the text of Daniel that would indicate that. And you've got to remember that at the time, there was no bound copy of the Bible. All these books existed separate entities out here. And there's just nothing in the text of Daniel that would warrant taking this passage as a statement of days equaling years.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, if we go to Numbers 14, the reason why it's contextually okay to say days and years is because the text says it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's right here, right? According to the number of days in which you spied out on the land, 40 days for every day a year. Like it says it. This is the declaration, the penalty, the judgment, so to speak, that's being made. When you go to Ezekiel.
Well, let's stop with this text for just a moment.
Yeah.
Notice that this is applied to a specific instance.
Yes.
This is not saying that in every case where you have
that's right
prophecy like this for 40 days that you are to understand a day for a year. This is talking about the number of days they were going to have to wander in the wilderness.
That's right.
And the word 40 is brought up. So 40 days will be like every day for a year. You'll bear your iniquity.
Yeah. So to your point,
specific thing.
Yeah, I often will say, okay, Adventist, let's say that's the case. Why aren't you doing the same thing for all the other days out there? Yeah. Why aren't we using years for those or picking other ones? Like, why this one? What gives you the right for that specific one? Well, Numbers, you should use years. If you go to Ezekiel, which I think is an interesting one.
Let's go
to. I think it's always funny because people don't even know what maybe they do know what it says.
The context of that, I mean, it's in the context of this, it's literally days.
Yeah.
I assign you a number of days, 390 days, equal to the number of years of their guild. So you should bear the guild of the house of Israel. When you completed these, you lie down the second time on your right side and bear for 40 days. I assign you 1 day for each year. Ezekiel apparently literally went out in front of the city and laid down this number of days. And they were seen as symbolic of the number of days, but he actually literally laid there for that length of time.
Well, and it's clearly a symbolic representation of what. So it's, again, the context of it is, yes, it's a judgment. Yes, it's very clear. We're not making an assertion. It's in the text.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I go back and say, okay, let's apply the same thing to Daniel 8. Please help me understand, Adventist friends, where Daniel tells me that for 2,300, let's just assume it's days, that you now, for every day, a year, like all the other ones that you use, tell you that for a day, use a year. But here, it doesn't say that. So why?
Yes. Contextually, you can't make that claim.
Correct. I would agree.
I asked this question, what possible meaning would that text have had to the generation that first read it, 2nd century now, to be told about an event that would occur in North America, in America,
yes.
in New England, in America,
Yes.
in the 19th century.
Yeah.
That would have
Not,
had no meaning for them whatsoever.
it certainly wouldn't have given them assurance that the persecution was going to be ending.
No, it wouldn't. No.
It would have been a little dismal to hear Daniel say, "So we got to wait for 2,300 years before this is going to end." You know.
Well, and two, if you jump on that statement where it says the vision is for the time of the end, let's just for a moment say that this actually does look at 1844. Well, 1844 was not the time of the end.
Yep. That's
so
right.
The vision is off at that point too.
Yep. 100%. All right. So these other two questions are going to be a little bit out of left field, but I feel like we need to ask them just because, like, I know both of these gentlemen that asked them, so they're good questions. I want to give them the time. The first one is this. Mike and Jerry, what is the importance of Gabriel only making an appearance in Daniel 8 and 9 and at the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus? And I would say, is there any connection or importance? And you can respond. Maybe there isn't a good answer. You can respond to that.
I would say in response to that question, that in the apocalyptic text, and we talked about this earlier, in the apocalyptic literature, you often have the visitation of an angelic feature in this personage. In this case, Gabriel, who is kind of the interpreter of the visions to the writer. That's what you have in Daniel, and in the gospel text, you have the same thing. It's understood that Gabriel is the interpreter of what is about to happen. Mm-hmm. And so he comes in that way. Now, there had developed in the interim between Daniel and New Testament, there had developed a whole hierarchy of these angelic beings. Gabriel was one of the highest ones. Mm-hmm. The name means mighty man of God. You also have Michael, who's mentioned in the book of Daniel and said to be the prince of Israel, which is another of these angelic figures that comes in contact with humanity. And I suppose if there is any importance to it, it would be that Gabriel was one of the high-ranking angelic personages mm-hmm. who engaged in this kind of mediary effort with human beings.
Yeah. I don't think I have a bunch more to add. I'm always a little bit reluctant to make overarching connections to something that may or may not be there. It is interesting that Gabriel is present at certain key events.
Yes.
I don't know why. I don't know. I mean, it's just supposition. If you kind of
in the understanding of the times, the people would have seen Gabriel. This guy is. He's from the top.
Yeah.
He represents the heavenly realms.
So it would carry maybe a level of divine authority. Yes. Is that kind of what?
Okay. This is not your ordinary angel, shall we say, making this interpretation. This guy ranks.
Yeah. Okay.
So that might have been one of the reasons why you have that reference to Gabriel as such.
Okay. Good. The follow-up question that Rick had is, could it be that Gabriel in Daniel 9 was announcing the Messiah's coming, and in Luke he was announcing he was here?
That gets us into Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks. And,
shall we say that for another episode?
I'm going to need one. This is a section of scripture. I'm reminded of James Montgomery's comment about this. Montgomery wrote a commentary on Daniel in the International Critical Commentary series, one of the great series. Yeah. He said that Daniel 9:24-27 is, and these are his exact words, is the dismal swamp of Old Testament exegesis. It's so difficult that it's just almost incomprehensible. And it seems like the farther you read in Daniel 9:24 and following, the more dense it becomes. It has been taken, however, as a messianic prophecy by some. And there's a basis for saying that. So that's one of those interpretations of it that has some merit. But it has been taken as a messianic prophecy.
And I think that gets into I think one of the other key elements as to why many don't subscribe because of Jesus and the comment in Matthew, and then because of Daniel 9 and the way, the dating and the visions and the way they all kind of fit together. I think there's a tendency to perceive if you date Daniel as 2nd century, that you undermine the messianic theme. I think that's the fear of some, and I would say that maybe that's a valid concern, but it doesn't necessarily that concern only arises because that's the lens through which you're seeing it.
Well, and you get the messianic interpretation because of the Mashiach, Messiah. The term is used in this passage. But that gets us into the chronology of this. The time span. It doesn't work out exactly.
Exactly.
Just to take an example, we don't know when Jesus was born. We know it was somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC, and perhaps even earlier. So you've got to have a definitive line there to make this prophecy work as a messianic prophecy. And you don't know, on the other end of it, you don't know when the crucifixion came. Precisely. I mean, you can say, it's a ballpark, 31, 32, but you can't go with ballpark figures with this. You have to make the dates come out correct. So that's one problem with taking this as a full-on messianic prophecy.
That makes sense. All right, well, let's round it out with the final question. And the final question relates to, I'm actually going to go to the passage itself. So Daniel 8:27. So this is the ending of the chapter. So Daniel, was overcome, and I lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was dismayed by the vision and did not understand. Now, some translations kind of paraphrase this differently, but the question is, what does Jerry understand Daniel 8:27 and Daniel not understanding? Why did he not understand? And I know that this kind of plays into some significant aspects of how Adventism perceives and why this question I think might arise. But what are your thoughts?
In apocalyptic texts, the visionary or the apocalyptist who's writing often has that response. They're often confused by it and need an angelic interpreter to understand it. That's true in 2nd Esdras. It's true in Zechariah and in Revelation. We find that in Daniel 9, he's still worried about this. And the prophecy of the 70 weeks is some kind of explanation about that vision. Except it's probably more confusing than the vision itself in that regard. But that's kind of a, shall we say, a literary motif that is used in apocalyptic writings. that
I
the
think
writer doesn't understand and needs interpretation for him to understand the vision?
one of the reasons why I think this is important, and I specifically left off verse 26 in the first reading, because the tendency for an Adventist is to then claim, well, the reason why he doesn't understand. Now, this is viewing it through the Adventist lens and injecting your own idea in, but it's because it's sealed up, and it's specifically what's sealed up. Well, it's the 2300, and that's because they wouldn't know about it until 1844.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, what would you say to that?
Well, okay, the sealing up of the vision is
Yep.
another apocalyptic motif
Yeah.
that is commonly used in apocalyptic writings. It is often sealed until a certain time.
Mm.
You're not told what many days from now means. I mean, you can jump to the conclusion that's talking about what the time of the end, which is referenced here earlier. But now 1844 was not the time of the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Paul says that we're living now in the time of the end,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
in the end of days. This is that the vision that he was given refers to many days from now. We don't know how far in advance of the event that he wrote this, that is talking about, and so we don't know what the many days means. It could be many days could mean a couple of years, could have meant 3 years, something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's in the time of the end. In chapter 12, you also have this sealing taking place, and the writer is trying to figure out then when this is all going to come to pass, and he comes up with 3 different calculations. None of them are the 2300.
Yep.
He has 1260 days. He has 1335 days. He has 1290 days and 1335 days.
Mm-hmm.
So what's going on there? It's uncertain. It seems like he's kind of casting around to figure out when these things will come about. And he's finally told, stand in your lot till the end of days, and you will come to your own. You'll come in your own lot, your own position.
Yeah.
It is characteristic of an apocalypse to do this kind of thing, to have the writer perplexed and in the dark and hoping for some explanation, and to have the writing sealed until a certain period of time.
Yeah.
That's common.
Well, Jerry, I wish we could continue talking. I already extended my my time with you by 30 minutes more than you wanted.
Well, I have enjoyed discussing all of this.
Well, I really do. I really do want to have several more, as many as you will offer us. I will accept. I appreciate the expertise. I appreciate the time that you have put into not just your commentary work, but teaching this stuff. I would encourage anyone that's been here for this evening and that's still with us or watching it later on, anyone, pick up Jerry's commentary. Pick it up if for any reason, then just to have it as all the footnotes with all the references, with all the information that you can go research to help understand. You may not agree with everywhere that Jerry lands. In fact, I'd be surprised if you did. That's the case with most scholars. Okay. But I would really encourage you to pick his book up. What book specifically? I don't have another screen for it, but it's the one that's been kind of up in the bottom part here. It's the Endgame commentary on the book of Daniel, and that's the image of it there in the bottom right. Pick it up. You can get it on Kindle. You can get it on Amazon, and it is a wealth of information. Looking forward to having you back, hopefully after the new year. Like I always say, it'll be maybe next year we can have you.
Yes, I would be happy to come back.
I love it, and we'll work through some more of this. Friends, thank you for being here. Those of you that have been in the chat, thank you for keeping it civil for the most part. Looking forward to hopefully responding to some additional questions that were up here. I know there was a lot of questions about the 70 weeks and some of the other kind of ins and outs as I was kind of, others that were mentioning things like this. The second vision, I know that always comes up. First vision, second vision, what is that? The Maria with regards to, and I always find it interesting that this is Adventist heretic. I'm not sure how to take that, but I love the name. I guess I'm an Adventist heretic too, at least an apostate. But Jerry, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it so much. I pray blessings over your family. I pray that you will enjoy this time of the year where we celebrate Jesus and his birth and the life, death, resurrection, all that stuff. I appreciate the time. Tell your family I said hi. And looking forward to seeing you on the next one. Okay, my friend?
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. We'll see you all later.